The Radical Secular Podcast. A demand for justice, equality, and rational public policy. Subscribe at YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and all the major podcast channels. Visit our website at theradicalsecular.com for articles, transcripts, and our complete library of episodes. Support us on Patreon, and follow us on social media.
Welcome to the Radical Secular Podcast. I'm Drew Scott.
I'm Sean Prophet.
And I'm Joe Occhipinti.
Today, we'll be starting our three-part analysis and breakdown of the HBO series Show Me a Hero. We here at the Radical Secular will always highlight books, movies, and series that we feel showcase strong secular and or progressive values that have a particular relevance to the times, that make us think about the world a little differently, or that we just think are worth talking about. With all that said, we felt this miniseries, released in 2015, just 2 months after Trump first came down the escalator and rose to the top of our most hated man alive lists, ticks all those boxes. This week, we'll be talking about the first 2 episodes of the series, and the Radical Secular team will be doing more breakdowns of the later episodes in future installments. But before we get to any of that, or our weekly synopsis of current events, I want to remind you, make sure to subscribe, hit the like button if you're watching us on YouTube, leave a comment, a review, and most importantly, tell your friends to listen. And if you're in a position to support the show, please head over to our Patreon page at patreon.com/theradicalsecular. We'd really appreciate your support. The Patreon page isn't much at the moment, but Patreon supporter exclusive content will be coming soon. New episodes of the show post Monday at noon Eastern on YouTube and all the major podcast channels. We also publish new articles weekly in our journal at theradicalsecular.com. The newest entry is by our esteemed co-host, Radical Secular co-founder, and our friend, Christoph Defoe. It's an August edition of his segment, Too Late News, in which he talks about some goals for both the Radical Secular team and himself. Head over to theradicalsecular.com and check it out. Now, let's see what everyone has got going on for t-shirts this week. Joe, let's see what you got going on.
I got this one on. I've worn this before, but a while ago.
Unity and diversity.
All right. Now, the reason why I wore this shirt is because, considering the show we're going to be covering, I mean, this is a hell of a challenge we had in this country to think ourselves that way. But it is a big national myth, you know, and I want to explore that a little bit too in these shows and what we're doing, because we really do have to challenge these narratives. We really do. We have to really critically challenge them. And I mean, America has never been united. I mean, we started out as, you know, very disparate settlers from the Middle Ages. It came from Europe, you know, medieval Europe. I mean, the Puritans, right? I mean, how crazy do you have to flee Europe for being too religious, right?
Yeah.
I mean, and then you know, the settlers in New England were very mercantile, nascent capitalism. Mid coast was, you know, the yeoman farmer types, and then in the South you had medievalism, you had feudalism, you had plantation, you know, economies. And right from the get-go, we had very, very different visions that have really never really resolved themselves, even to this day. And this is what we're still struggling with.
Well, I'm wearing today, I have a No Justice, No Peace shirt, and it says also Black Lives Matter. And I wore this shirt today because, I mean, it's obviously a good sentiment for any time. But in particular today, that slogan was chanted on various episodes of this show, and it was chanted by white people who were marching to protest this housing being placed in their neighborhood. So it's just very interesting how it's kind of been co-opted. So the right wing has kind of co-opted some of the original tactics of the left, and so it is definitely a good sentiment. But obviously, everybody has a different concept of what justice actually means.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Right on. Well, this week I'm sporting a Frenzal Rom t-shirt. They're an Australian punk rock band, and it's got it's a Star Trek spoof that has a portrait of Leonard Nimoy And in one hand, in one hand he's doing the Vulcan salute, and then in the other hand he's giving the middle finger. And I'd have to stand up and mess up my setup here, but the bottom says "Live long, prosper, and get fucked." So
that is awesome. That hits all the notes.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we're talking about great television here, and it's always a good time for a good Star Trek reference here.
Absolutely, every show.
Yep.
So now we'll move on to our weekly breakdown of current events. The first topic being recent COVID restrictions being implemented across the nation. At the risk of sounding like a broken record, it is becoming increasingly difficult to deny that more drastic action is needed to manage and combat the pandemic. The irresponsible and dangerously ignorant individuals who refuse to get vaccinated are a threat to the health and safety of all of us. Their decision to not get their jab doesn't just affect them, but all of us, since it leaves us more vulnerable to the Delta and who knows what other future variants. More extreme measures are needed to end this pandemic than most Americans and many worldwide are willing to undertake. However, we did see that in quite a broken clock is right once a day moment, Amy Coney Barrett rejected an attempt to block Indiana University's vaccine mandate for students in their upcoming fall semester. This, to me, is a huge win and a big step in the right direction from a very unlikely source, no less. In addition, the city of San Francisco has announced some of the toughest restrictions for the unvaccinated, barring them from gyms, restaurant, bars, and other indoor gatherings. Hopefully we see more of this, because as much as it may not be easy, we need to suck it up and do what needs to be done to fight this virus. I'd like to bring up this chart showing where we were a month ago in terms of community transmission versus where we are now. The difference is quite startling, especially when you consider how readily available the vaccines are nationwide. Seeing stats like this, and with things like the Supreme Court rejection, it seems like we're reaching a point where more and more people are getting fed up with those who are unwilling to do their part. And by do their part, I mean wear a mask and get a shot. It's not like anyone's asking them to storm the beaches of Normandy or anything. So with these sorts of developments, are we reaching a turning point in what Americans are willing to do and let both the public and private sector do to fight COVID? Sean, I know we discussed this a bit last week. What do you think of these developments?
I mean, this is just more of the same. And Joe and I were talking about it a minute ago before we started, and we're at our wits' end. It's the same old libertarian shit spiced with lies. This should be automatic, right? There should be no, will you or won't you wear a mask, or will you or won't you get a vaccine? This is in any scientifically based society where we have technology and know-how that can save lives. It shouldn't be a question. It's not a matter of personal freedom. I don't understand this. It's like this is a matter of a system. When you have a threat, you respond to the threat. You don't respond to the threat, you endanger everyone. With citizenship comes responsibility. I feel like we're just all broken records at this point. We're never going to solve this, though, until we solve the problem of propaganda media generally. Because remember, convincing people to do things in a free society is a process where you sort of build messaging, you build good messaging, and people gradually fall into line, or at least that's how it was maybe up until the 90s when Fox News and AM talk radio really got going. And now what you have is constant counter messaging, basically rendering a certain segment of society to be completely intransigent. And the more, somebody brought up this example of how we all, in the 90s, every kid learned that if you're going to dispose of six-pack rings, you cut them so that they don't hurt animals, right? And they were using that as an example of a really successful messaging campaign. And I was going, no, it wasn't anything special. There was just no Fox News. There was no Tucker Carlson telling people to throw their six-pack rings in the river specifically because it hurt animals, right? And that's what's going on right now. The right-wing messaging is deliberately trying to hurt people. And of course, social media is a huge culprit. Disintermediation has removed all gatekeepers. Anyone can make a web page that looks as good as anybody else's. This junk is not really distinguishable for a lot of people from the New York Times. And so what we're finding out, of course, is that unfettered freedom of conscience actually doesn't work in a free society. To have true freedom, you need guardrails.
Yeah, like we were saying last week, freedom needs context to be a virtue.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, Joe, you've been keeping a very close eye on the COVID stats and developments all along. What are your thoughts on these new community transmission levels, as well as the aforementioned regulations and rulings?
Well, we're blinder than we used to be, which is really kind of depressing. The data is just not being as forthright. A lot of states are just not reporting as much. We're testing less. Florida is the Florida reporting system is a basket case. They're once a week. They're not even reporting counties anymore. It's like the red states are turning more and more towards like what you would see in petty dictatorships around the world. They just want to suppress information. It's appalling. Our ability to tackle this pandemic has been reduced because of that. On top of what you said, Sean, with all the intransigence around mask wearing and vaccinations and so forth. But on the bright side, one of the things that I found encouraging, especially I was down in Florida last week, and there's a lot of pushback against DeSantis, or Death Santis, as I like to call him.
Death Santis, that's right.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of communities are just defying the state government right now. And if you look at, for example, in Orange County, where they had an opt-out for masks because they had to, only 4% of the student body opted out. Everyone else wore masks and decided that was okay. So, I mean, that certainly isn't 40% of the population anymore. So, at a gut level, at a real fundamental, visceral level, it's my kids' level. People get it, and that's saying something too, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, another briefly, I wanted to turn to another corner of COVID-related news that I wanted to touch on, which was Scarlett Johansson and her current lawsuit against Disney. Now, for those who aren't aware, she is suing for damages related to Disney releasing the new Black Widow movie, an installment of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, on their Disney Plus streaming service, instead of in theaters only. Apparently, her salary was tied to the box office gross. Now, on one hand, if she had a contract, then Disney should have probably worked something out before this release. I can appreciate that she's a woman in an industry that isn't always kind to women, and that Disney has obscene amounts of money and power in the entertainment world, which makes them the Goliath in this scenario, if we're making that analogy. But on the other hand, she herself has a net worth of about $160 million. And I'm not keen on the premise of her suit, which is essentially based around making a crowded theater the only way to watch a film during a pandemic. Now, Sean, we've talked about this before on social media and whatnot, about movie theaters and their business model being flawed, and how technology becoming more and more affordable has made it easier than ever before to have a theater-like experience at home. I mean, I myself have a 4K TV and a 5.1 Dolby surround sound system with a subwoofer that's comparable to a theater experience. So what do you think of this suit and this development? And what do you think it says about the future of entertainment and moviegoing as it relates to the pandemic?
Well, I mean, you probably don't want to get me started on this topic because, being somebody who was in the industry for a while and, I've got some very strong opinions. And one of those is I think theaters are becoming irrelevant. The only reason I ever want to go to a theater ever again is to see an IMAX film. Or maybe if there's something that I really want to see in 3D. I enjoyed the last Star Wars film in 3D. But I might go once a year, maybe once every 2 years to a theater because there's just no reason for it. And the industry needs to adjust to this. I was actually happy when they started releasing films theatrically and for streaming at the same time, because it makes sense. The whole industry has been based on selling films 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times because of these different, you got your theatrical window, you used to have your VHS, your DVD, your cable window, your regular television window, your foreign distribution window. It just goes on and on and on. And it's like they're just feeding at the trough of selling this thing multiple times. Why not just make it so that you pay, I'd pay anywhere from $20 to $50 to watch a first run film at home because, you're going to have your whole family with you if you have a bunch of people. And you can do that. And it's a good deal for the consumer. And it also should be a good deal for the studio because they can cut out the middleman. There's no theater that gets a cut of this, right? So as far as stars having participation in box office. I mean, they should be able to work that out.
Yeah, I think so too. I think something should have worked out, but it does raise some interesting questions for sure. Joe, do you have anything you want to add here?
Well, I mean, Sean, you're absolutely right. Technology changes things. The movie industry has changed dramatically. So has the music industry and many other, cultural mediums. And that's to be expected. And you go with it, right? But in terms of the actual lawsuit, it's kind of depressing that we've just lost so much touch with our basic understanding of civic duty and social contracts and just personal responsibility. I mean, to put people in danger when you don't have to, it just is the thoughtlessness of it. I don't know, the denial of it. I'm not sure what's going on in her mind, but it's got to be it should be a consideration that you go and you work it out with Disney rather than a lawsuit. I mean, that's what comes to mind.
I'd be willing to bet, though, also that, 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, it wasn't at all clear that there was going to be a Delta surge. And I bet you this whole suit was probably conceived when the danger wasn't what it is now. And I just think that theaters shouldn't be open when we're in the middle of a situation like this, where on the one hand, if everybody was vaccinated, no problem, right? But since everybody won't get vaccinated, any sort of gathering place, whether it's a church or a theater, I don't care where it is. I don't care, concert, sports. If you're getting together with other people, you're putting lives in danger. And we're not responding. We're just acting as if this is a matter of opinion or something.
Especially indoor venues, which we know are much more dangerous.
Now let's move briefly to a story I want to very quickly follow up on, Andrew Cuomo. So Sean, in our discussion about Cuomo in last week's episode, I compared him to Anthony Weiner, and we both agreed that he needed to go, despite anything else we may have previously said or thought about him. After mountains of pressure, including the resignation of his top aide and condemnation from Biden himself, might I add, he has finally resigned. And on top of that, his successor is the Empire State's first woman governor. Huzzah!
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, again, I don't want to spend too much time on this, guys, but I bring it up because one of the things that separates us from our knuckle-dragging GOP counterparts in the country is that we actually have moral standards that we put before political interest or a cult-like worship of any of our leaders. The Democrats aren't perfect, but at least we clean house when called for, and sometimes even to a fault. Cough, Al Franken, cough, cough. But we got rid of Cuomo when we found out what a monster he was. We didn't make him our party's standard bearer or our presidential nominee. Anything you guys want to say about the end of this frustrating and embarrassing saga?
Well, we also, as Democrats, are better at systems, right? And understanding that. And the system is working. It's starting to work. Now, people are being held accountable. These powerful men in particular are being held accountable for their bad behavior, for their sexual predation, essentially. And the whole thing worked out. I'm glad that Cuomo's not there anymore. I'm glad he voluntarily stepped down. It shows that it gives the whole process legitimacy so that women can trust it a little more. And I don't blame women for not trusting it because it hasn't been working for a long, long time, if ever. And now it's beginning to work, at least in parts of our society, right? Not so much with the Republicans. I mean, look who we have for the Supreme Court, right? But it is working in some places. And that's a good thing because sustainably, you have to have these systems because in the whims of politics, the whims of culture, you could have one victory, it could be a great victory, but the next year or the next few years, you could have a whole different environment. And what you need is these institutions, these checks and balances that are going to be there and they're going to be solid. And that's what we're trying to develop here. So yes, I think it's all looking good to me. I mean, it's pretty positive.
Yeah, well, I think, we stuck up for Cuomo 5 months ago or whenever it was when the investigation was first announced because we wanted to wait for the investigation. And he gave a speech at that time and he was, he apologized, he was contrite, and he sort of put a good face on. And the problem is now there's been an investigation and he gave the same speech again oh, I didn't mean to hurt anybody. I'm sorry if I offended you, kind of thing. And he just looks like an absolute fool. He didn't take responsibility. He actually said he blames the culture. He says, I didn't change my behavior, but the line of acceptable behavior moved. It's like, are you kidding me?
Tone deaf.
Yeah, completely. And the thing that's been brought up multiple times is that men don't touch other men this way. And Cuomo actually is a bit of a touchy-feely guy. There are pictures of him like touching men on the face and stuff like that. So he may have a little bit more of an excuse than a lot of people, because that's just how he is. But this investigation that came out from the Attorney General of New York was damning. And instead of trying to put positive spin on it, he could have acted much more statesmanlike. And to me, he squandered his entire legacy by how he responded to this. He's always now going to be remembered as this creep. And Colbert was just ruthless and right on every single count. He did this little cartoon where there was a bullshit penguin that was like, as Cuomo's speaking, the penguin like jumps every time he lies. And finally the penguin gets tired and can't jump anymore because it's just so many lies, right? And it's sad. I'm glad we hold our people accountable, but I mean, as a man, as a human being, he disappointed me in a huge way.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. For sure.
And we can't forget that this kind of sexual predation, this sexual harassment and assault is very damaging. It's just a very damaging thing to women and men too, who experience it. It hurts. It causes grief. It causes people to have to not function as well in life. It's a burden that people shouldn't have to carry. It's not hard. It's not hard to be respectful. It really isn't.
Not
Absolutely.
at all.
So this week saw the release of the new Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report. And surprise, surprise, the results are deeply alarming, to say the least. Climate change, along with COVID, is the most significant issue facing humanity today, and we'll continue to keep spotlighting it here on The Radical Secular. Not that it is news to anyone who respects science, but the IPCC has confirmed what we already knew. The jury is in. Climate change is real, and humans are to blame. This report makes that very clear. Some of the changes to our planet, such as rising ocean levels, are irreversible even over hundreds of years. However, not all hope is lost, as we can still reverse some of the changes over the next several decades if we significantly lower our CO2 output worldwide. We all treat this issue with the utmost importance here. But Joe, I know this is something that you are particularly passionate about. What is your reaction to the report?
Think about it. This document has to be signed off by the very same government representatives that it condemns. And it's this powerful. So, no joke, right? There's a lot of equivocation that happens with these reports. There's a lot of politics and so forth, but they're just going right for it. They're not pulling any punches here. That's how serious it is. The plan countries have put forward so far are, according to the report, insufficient. Advancement in climate science has been unequivocal. As you said, Drew, it's humans are causing this. And if it weren't for human activity, in this period, we would have seen a very slight cooling, in fact, naturally. And so 1.5C, keeping it to that level, is a pipe dream. It's not going to happen. It just isn't. And we will probably see 1.5C this decade. We're close to it now. And natural sinks in the world, the natural processes that sort of sequester carbon, are now showing that they're emitting carbon. This is extremely ominous, right? Like the Amazon may be doing that. There was a study that showed that. We're talking about climate amplifications, where humans are the trigger, the catalyst to then engender all these natural changes that can really increase the climates. These things that we've seen through paleoclimatology over and over and over again that have been documented that happen in natural systems. So I think that what this report is saying is that rapid decarbonization is not enough when you really read it. which means we're going to have to do some real serious changes to all of our political economy. We're going to have to sequester carbon back into the ground through different agricultural techniques, through technologies, through different practices. And the other thing that this report is telling us is that we're starting with a radically damaged biosphere to begin with, right? It's like the last, thousands of years of humanity have deforested this planet. They've desertified this planet. We've had massive biodiversity loss across everything, especially in the oceans. And climate change is happening under these conditions on top of all this. So the only thing I can say is that the unprecedented is the new normal. And if we're going to solve this thing, we're going to have to do it now, and we're going to have to put all hands on deck to do it. And that's it. It's not, I can't be any more serious, honestly.
Absolutely. Sean, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I do. And I think that we have to understand that there are several responses to this that we've been seeing. The first, obviously, is denial. But there's another response that I really want to call out today, and that is somebody made a comment on one of my posts about climate, and she said something along the lines is, nature is going to wipe us out all anyway. It's time for a reset. And this is a horrible, no good attitude. It is murderous. It is abject surrender. And it is also a misinterpretation, like by claiming that nature is going to wipe us out. No, we have done this to ourselves. Every climate disaster is a crime scene. The people responsible have names and addresses. And of course, they have the complicity of consumers who just want to keep consuming fossil fuels and meat and other things without thinking about it. And of course, that's got to stop. But we already know this about humanity, that left to their own devices, okay, people will continue to consume. And so it is up to our leadership. It's just like COVID, right? We have people who don't want their vaccines. You have to force them to take the vaccine. Okay, and it's the same with climate. If you want people to stop emitting carbon, you have to put in place penalties. And of course, the fossil industry is, is preventing that. They have blocked climate legislation. We came this close to a carbon cap and trade scheme in 2009 when Obama had a majority, and it failed in the House of Representatives by like 2 votes, and he had a Senate majority, so it would have passed. And this is, so these things have long-term consequences. It's endlessly frustrating to me. July was the hottest month. July of 2021 was the hottest month in 142 years of record keeping globally. And this problem, like Joe said, there are now positive feedbacks. This is affecting food prices. It's only the beginning. We've seen cattle herds, being sold off, dying off. Mexico has a huge problem with drought, and it's other parts of the world. People think that all we have to worry about is heat and fires and maybe hurricanes. They understand, but that's preposterous. What we really have to worry about is violence, destabilization caused by social breakdown.
Absolutely.
And we're about to test this thing. I'm sure everybody's heard of this, the 9 meals rule about civilization. And the rule is that if you can't feed people, if they miss 9 meals, they revert to barbarism to feed themselves. And we're going to start seeing that being tested in places. And this is what really scares me, is that this is not just, somehow nature's going to wipe us out. No, we're talking about the possibility of war and genocide wiping us out. And that's not going to be any fun for anybody. And there won't be any reset. There's not going to be anybody to reset it for if we can't feed ourselves. First that happens, we go to a much smaller population. And after that, then it becomes uninhabitable for any humans. Like if we went to like 6 degrees Celsius or something like that, nobody can survive with that. Maybe in Antarctica, you'd get, handfuls of people surviving after all the ice melted. But it's a very bleak situation. And I'm not a prophet of doom. I think we can survive this. but we have to take it seriously and we have to do it now.
Absolutely. Definitely. Well said. Well said. So with that, I'd like to move on to our main topic for the week, an analysis and breakdown of the David Simon masterpiece, HBO's Show Me a Hero. Now, the show first aired 2 episodes a night back in 2015, so I thought that would be a good way to structure a breakdown from the Radical Secular team. In this installment, we'll be talking about the first 2 episodes, part 1 and part 2. We'll get more into detail here in a moment, but as a quick initial reaction, what did you guys think of these first 2 episodes? Sean?
Well, I got to be careful because I watched the whole thing in one sitting, so it might be hard for me to limit my comments to the first 2 episodes. But the whole series, it was great. I'm grateful to you, Drew, for making me aware of this because I hadn't seen it, and it was really great. It was an illustration, though, about the limits of majoritarian politics to solve problems for minorities, because we know that we got a white majority in America. It's shrinking, but it doesn't have to vote for rights for Black people. That was, that's something that it's very tough when you're in a city where you got an overwhelmingly white population and Black people need housing and white people don't want it. Like this is, and the nuanced part of this show was about the type of housing, where it's placed, how it's designed determines its success or failure. So that was good. And also buried in this series is a healthy dose of critical race theory, looking at the history of building freeways, housing projects, redlining, all that kind of stuff. Really, really educational. And we also have to look at this in terms of the new census and demographic changes that are going on, which, this brings new focus to why and how the right wing began to direct its fire toward quote, unelected judges. You always hear them talk about this, right? Legislating from the bench. This is their big boogeyman over the past 40 years. And this was a perfect example. This series was, judges are often the only line of defense for minorities from the tyranny of the majority. And the whole story of Yonkers tells you exactly why right-wingers are so furious.
Yeah,
Definitely. Joe, how about you? What'd you think?
Well, Sean, I agree with everything you said. I thought it was very astute. I would add that the show itself, the art of it, right? It was very descriptive and narrative, and it wasn't on the nose at all. So, in a way, it just showed you these things, and you could see them and judge them for yourself. So, I thought that made the series really powerful, right? And the other thing I liked about it is that it really sort of gives you a good description of the underbelly of local politics, and also how racism functions at these sort of micro levels, at these deeper levels of society, in these boardrooms and in these meeting halls and so forth, and in people's attitudes and practices. And it isn't just about using the wrong words or it's so much deeper than that. And this I think the show really gets to that.
Absolutely. I think you're spot on. As far as the underbelly of local politics, I think in a lot of our media, a lot of it showcases national politics, and these sorts of local political stories, which can be just as important, often get lost in the weeds. So that was one of the things that I liked about the series as well.
Yeah.
Before we go into Show Me a Hero, to provide a little context, I'd like to talk a little bit about David Simon, the writer himself, and some of his previous work. There are some who swear by Aaron Sorkin, but for my money, I'll take David Simon over him or just about any other showrunner any day. Not only is Simon the mastermind behind some incredible work, but he's also a staunch, take-no-bullshit liberal. As a recent example, former state treasurer, GOP Senate candidate, and raging, rotting twat waffle, Josh Mandel, recently tweeted, quote, "The founding fathers would have tarred and feathered Dr. Fauci," end quote. David Simon's response, quote, "You useless mutt. In addition to enslaving other races and denying women the vote, the fathers had wooden teeth, bled sick people, and regularly defecated in cramped boxes in their rear yards. Epidemiologists and virologists would have blown their colonial minds," end quote. So you can see why I like this guy. David Simon started working as a police reporter for the Baltimore Sun out of college from 1982 to 1995 and spent most of his time there covering crime. He was a union captain when the writing staff went on strike in 1987 over benefit cuts, and he was still pissed about everything that happened in that situation after it ended. He eventually took a leave of absence saying, quote, "I got out of journalism because some sons of bitches bought my newspaper and it stopped being fun," end quote. He then spent a year shadowing the homicide detective unit in Baltimore and writing a book on his experiences, Homicide: A Year on the Killing Streets, which was eventually adapted into the series Homicide: Life on the Street. And while that was a good show, Simon himself has said that it didn't quite reflect the book in the way that he hoped. In 1997, he co-authored another book, The Corner, which was also developed into a miniseries for HBO, the first of many and excellent and powerful series that he would develop for the network. The show received 3 Emmy Awards, including Outstanding Writing for a Miniseries or Movie, for Simon and his co-writer David Mills. From there, he began a collaboration with fellow writer and former Baltimore homicide detective Ed Burns, based on both Burns' frustration with the bureaucracy of the police department and Simon's frustration with his time as a reporter. That collaboration was The Wire. Now, The Wire is arguably some of the finest television ever produced. Even Barack Obama called it, quote, "one of the greatest, not just television shows, but pieces of art in the last few decades," end quote, and has said that Omar Little is his favorite character, which is kind of funny. I remember when Obama was talking about it, he was saying, now that's not an endorsement. I just find him to be an interesting character, because Omar Little is a murderous stick-up man. But this is probably why Barack Obama agreed to do an interview with Simon back in 2015. The Wire was not just a great crime show, but an incredible breakdown of American society, with each of its 5 seasons covering a different facet of city life, and how they are affected by the drug war, and how the flaws in their respective systems essentially mirror each other. The police in season 1, the dock workers and unions in season 2, the politicians in season 3, the schools in season 4, and the media in season 5. I remember reading that Simon said that if he was to do a 6th season, if they were going to do one, he probably would have done it on the immigration system. But The Wire, despite its brilliance, never really reached the heights of success that other later HBO series did, like Sopranos or Game of Thrones, but it never dipped in quality. In 2008, Simon followed that series up with another collaboration with his writing partner Ed Burns, Generation Kill, a TV miniseries adaptation of the book of the same name. Now, this series took a visceral look at the Iraq War and asked some really tough questions. It tells the story of the first 40 days of the 2003 invasion of Iraq as it was experienced by the 1st Reconnaissance Battalion and their embedded reporter, Evan Wright, who authored the book. Generation Kill was nominated for 11 Emmys and won 3, including Outstanding Miniseries. In 2010, Simon created and developed another HBO series, Treme, a drama about people from New Orleans trying to rebuild their lives in the aftermath of Katrina. Set directly after the storm, it largely focused on all the elements of the city's music culture, but like The Wire, it was so much more than it appeared to be on the surface, addressing housing, crime, cuisine, corruption, local politics, and so much more. Treme had such an impact on me personally that it actually inspired me to take a trip to New Orleans to experience Mardi Gras for myself back in 2017. I drove from North Hollywood, California, all the way to NOLA and saw everything in the southwestern United States that I ever wanted to see along the way. I went to the Grand Canyon. I stood on the exact spot in Dealey Plaza where Kennedy was shot. I even stopped by Walt's Car Wash and some other locations from Breaking Bad. And that's not to mention Mardi Gras itself, which the music alone more than lived up to the way it was presented on the show. I got to ask, have either of you guys ever been to Mardi Gras?
I have been to New Orleans, never Mardi Gras. And I have to say, I'm not a huge fan of the city. It was unbearably hot when I was there in the 90s, and not totally sure when I go back. The humidity, like living in the Southwest, California, Vegas, whatever. I mean, it's just, we don't deal with much humidity here. And going to the South, it's just, it's unbelievable. So, but a lot of culture came from New Orleans, and like the rest of the South, it kind of seems to be in a lot of ways a culture of suffering. The contrast between the old Southern aristocracy and the general inequality there. And it was just really tough for me just watching on television, seeing how Katrina impacted the poor neighborhoods disproportionately. And this is another story that relates deeply to critical race theory, the design of those neighborhoods to be flooded if there was ever a breach in the levees. So I don't know. New Orleans, we'll see. Maybe I'll make it back someday.
Yeah. What about you, Joe?
No, I haven't. I mean, I've been to Mardi Gras celebrations in South America, and one of them I went to was crazy. I mean, it was like dancing all night and incredible amounts of drinking. I mean, just fabulous amounts of drinking. And I never realized alcohol could be a mind-altering, like psychedelic, because when you combine it with dancing all night, like these rhythmic dances and all that massive amount of drinking, it was bizarre. It was just intense. But I don't know if New Orleans Mardi Gras is anything like that. But if it is, man, I got to go try it out.
Yeah, when I was there, they were serving drinks. They were called hurricanes, which I thought was, a solid reflection of the city's dark humor.
Yeah,
for sure. But so when Treme ended its 4-season run back in 2013, fans of Simon's work, such as myself, were left wondering what his next project would be. So that brings us to 2015's Show Me a Hero. Now, so far we've only discussed these series in general without getting into many, if any, spoilers, episode specifics, or plot points or anything like that. But from here on out, we will be getting into spoiler territory for this series. So if you want to experience the show fresh for yourself, as well as have a better understanding of what we're talking about, this is your spoiler warning. Although I do have to wonder, can you spoil a true story? Anyway. Pause and go check out the first 2 episodes of Show Me a Hero on HBO Max and come back. We will be right here. So, this series is set in late 1980s Yonkers, New York, and is based on the true story of Nick Wasicsko, who at the beginning of the story is a young and upcoming city councilman looking to boost his political career. He's eager to ascend to mayor and is convinced by some party leaders that he actually has a shot. And in the process of campaigning, he uncovers a wedge issue that he can use to get elected. A federal judge has ruled that the city of Yonkers is essentially segregated and that they are required to build affordable housing units for low-income families. The largely white community is, needless to say, not thrilled about poor minorities moving into their neighborhood and are ready to vote for anyone willing to fight and appeal the ruling. Nick sees this opportunity and starts speaking out against the housing project, promising to fight it. Based on this, he starts gaining momentum and, to his surprise, wins. But the celebration doesn't last long, as immediately after taking over the mayor's office, he begins to understand that the housing projects simply need to be built, or the city faces litigation, fines, imprisonment for the city council members, even city bankruptcy if they do not comply and come up with a plan to build the housing. They really did a great job of underscoring this at the end of the first episode, with the phone call from the lawyers to the mayor's office ringing during the victory party, like that nagging, irking feeling that your joy will be short-lived because you're forgetting something. I thought that was a masterful use of sound and editing to close out the first episode. What did you guys think of how episode 1 ended?
Well, I got to say, the story arc of Nick Wasicsko from young political opportunist to hero was very compelling. And the shift from supporting the appeal of the judgment against the city to it slowly dawning on him that he was now going to have to support compliance was the beginning of that journey. And it's really, it's just, I have to reflect because he's driving around the city and everybody is just organically supporting him. I mean, comes out of nowhere and everybody's yard sign has got his name on it. And he just can't believe his good fortune. And this is all because they think he's going to be this white hero to save them from this desegregation initiative that's been court ordered. So, and then, hijinks ensue after he has to switch sides on that point. So very interesting, very, very compelling story.
For sure.
Yeah, and I think this series really converges a lot of these political realities that we face in America, and it does so in a way that it really shows how relentless this challenge is for the entire justice project that we're all interested in, right? The politicians are vying for their own success, mostly, like he was at first, and then this phone call comes at the end, right? And it's a ringing, and this ringing is the beginning of a wake-up call, and it's the beginning of his transformation. It's the beginning of what you were just talking about, Sean. This really interesting story.
Absolutely. So, being a fan of Simon's previous work, I was all in for this series right from the get-go when I first heard it was coming. But it wasn't until episode 2 that it really grabbed me, in no small part due to those city council meeting and town hall scenes. At the time that this was airing, the Trump campaign was only just getting started, which makes you think about Simon's foresight into some of these issues when you consider how much longer the series must have been in development and production before then. The parallels between the white rage we see from these angry Yonkers yuppies and the frothing at the mouth insanity we saw and still see at Trump rallies are so stark, it's quite shocking. There are moments that even give you some insight as to how Nazism spreads and flourishes when you hear town hall attendees discussing amongst each other that the Jews are behind the housing and other heinously hateful rhetoric. What did you guys find most striking about those scenes?
Well, it's like you said, this thing was in development, obviously, for years. And the time period when the series was shot even was before Trumpism really took hold. And the whole thing is actually terribly unsurprising if you know American history. And even in California, I mean, like, we've seen this in my neighborhood of West Hills, which, is actually the whitest and oldest neighborhood in LA, where I lived for 25 years. The racism is appalling. This is an area that votes 2/3 Democratic. And yet, when I got onto, for the first time, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, the Facebook community page for West Hills, the racism that's there is just appalling. And I mean, recently there was a Proposition HHH, I think it was, in Los Angeles that passed a few years back, maybe it was 2017, and it raised sales tax like a quarter cent or maybe a half cent to provide housing for the homeless. And so one of those housing units was slated to be built at Topanga and Roscoe, which is very, that's right on the border, the northern border of West Hills. And the vitriol that was on that community page about that housing development, it's like, really, you guys are Democrats? Like, I mean, honestly, and of course, maybe this was the third of the Valley residents who are not Democrats, right? Because there's a lot of them as well, but they kind of seed the opposition. And so what was going on in this show in Yonkers is something that, in LA, people aren't marching, but the equivalent now is this constant vitriol on the community pages. And I had to leave the page and block a lot of people. And even Santa Monica, I've also had experience with something like 75% Democratic or more, and they turn out reliable opposition whenever, like the community town hall meetings that are held, public hearings, whenever there's low-income housing proposed. And so this is absolutely bipartisan, and it's not enough to be a liberal or Democrat. This is why we need wokeness. I mean, this could help us define what it actually means to be woke. Fuck your lip service to Black Lives Matter. To me, I mean, woke people are the ones who are willing to live next to low-income housing and not pitch a fit, right? Are you willing to take a small hit on your property value so that someone else can have a place to live at all, Or are you going to be so protective of your neighborhood that even the idea, you'd rather see somebody sleeping in their own shit on the street than, put up nice public housing for them next to where you live. And so that's all people are asking for, and you can't even give them that. I mean, it's just, this is what this whole series was about. And I think anybody who still has a problem with this should watch this series.
Yeah,
definitely.
I had the same experience of like how this reminded me of so many other instances that I've seen or experienced. This is striking, this universality of these sort of tribal sentiments, these racial sentiments that always seem to be there in society, no matter what it is, whether it's Nazi Germany or here or back in history. It's always seems that there's always this contingent that's always a problem, and at times they organize themselves into something far more dangerous, some political movement like fascism or whatnot. And when I was watching the crowds and so forth, and the hatefulness and the rage. There's something really bizarre and scary about these group dynamics. How they just feed on each other, and how they create this kind of like this miasma of like rage, when this happens. And here it was again, in this film.
Yeah, the mob mentality, absolutely. So in addition to the politicians, we're also introduced to several other characters who live in the projects, including Doreen, a troubled young girl whose parents are clearly worried about some of her choices, and Norma, a healthcare worker who is losing her sight from diabetes. We see Doreen's boyfriend selling drugs and having run-ins with the cops, but we also hear him talk about setting goals for himself in order to be able to take care of Doreen and their coming baby. Unfortunately, he dies suddenly, leaving her to take care of their baby alone. It's also worth noting that Doreen's father is played by Michael Potts, who had the very memorable role of Brother Mouzone on The Wire. Like many directors and showrunners, Simon often uses many of the same actors in various projects, and many of the actors from The Wire pop up in various roles in this series. So we also see Alma, a single mother from the Dominican Republic struggling to provide for her children, telling them she has to work and live elsewhere in order to make money for the family. So guys, what are your thoughts on these characters and how they're presented and all of their honest virtues and flaws, considering that they're the ones that the raging town hall attendees are screaming about?
Oh, what I saw was a collection of very strong families trying to survive in near impossible conditions of being warehoused into high-rise apartments absolutely not fit for human occupancy.
Yeah, spot on.
Yeah, very much so. Honestly, I look at this, and it's really depressing because we're still struggling with it today.
So this show focuses a lot on the issue of public housing. And Joe, when we were discussing about doing a breakdown of Show Me a Hero on the Radical Secular here, you mentioned that you were going to be teaching a class on urban geography in the fall. So what connections do you see between the subject matter in your course and the themes in this series?
There's a lot. And let's start with the fact that the real problem stems from a segregated and racist society. And all of this is tied to civil rights. It's tied to urban civil unrest. It also has a lot to do with white flight phenomena that happened in this country and the urban decline that's associated with all those things. American cities hit rock bottom in the 70s and 80s. And a lot of them recovered, but some of them haven't as much, like Detroit, for example. What this series highlights is a shift during this time towards scattered housing sites as an alternative, and as part of the solution to this bleak landscape that American cities found themselves in during this time. And let's not forget the effects of housing, or lack of housing, I should say. It's homelessness. And this is why public housing became part of the picture in American cities. And the first public housing, in fact, appeared, in the modern sense, appeared in the 1930s as part of the New Deal. In the late 40s, new laws focused on providing housing for the veterans coming back from World War II, and in combination with the GI Bill. And it's important to note here that all of these beneficiaries were really white, middle-class people, or working-class people. And that didn't really begin to change until the 50s, when some court cases started to kick in, and there was some changes at that level. And at that time, large projects began to pop up in major cities that service the poor, urban people of color, and so forth. During that time, in the 50s, though, people might not know this, there were 4 times as many units demolished in these areas than there were built under the auspices of eradicating blight. So it was just another way of really just sticking it to people, right? Yeah. They didn't really provide more housing. They got rid of tons of housing, hundreds of thousands of units. The projects themselves were mismanaged and very poorly funded, unevenly funded. And the architecture itself was also a big problem. There's a whole thing about how you design the physical space really has a lot to do with success in social systems, right? And that all led to what you're talking about, Sean. There's just these inhuman conditions that, just should never have happened. And this is when HUD was formed, a new cabinet secretary, Housing and Urban Development, in mid-60s. And in part because of these challenges and this backlash and this resistance that was arising to public housing. But even at that time, though, despite some court cases to the contrary, federal housing segregation practices was still strong and really much part of the problem. And they were found unconstitutional in the 1949, but it didn't never really filtered into the process. There weren't any court cases, lawsuits and so forth at that time. There was still effectively the public housing still had this mission to segregate at an effective level. And eventually by 1968, some explicit forms of this segregation were banned. But at the same time, there was provisions in there that really encouraged more white flight by continuing to concentrate people of color in urban clusters alone by themselves, despite all of the rhetoric, right, and all the laws. Eventually, lawsuits then started, right? And I think the first one was like in late 50s or early 60s, but then there was more in the 70s, and eventually led to the one in 1985 in Yonkers that highlights this miniseries that we were talking about. So the courts had created a framework to fight and challenge segregation, but it didn't really kick in for a long time. But eventually it did. So the resistance and trouble by the white residents of Yonkers actually, sadly, ended up hurting efforts to provide more of these novel scattered housing units. Not that they were perfect, they have issues, but they're much better, than the alternative. And because communities were scared by all the controversy, they were scared by the protests and so forth. And don't forget, all this coincided with a period of right-wing backlash. This is the Ronald Reagan era against all forms of public services, not just housing, right? Cutbacks. It coincided with the crack epidemic, which was a huge tragedy in urban areas. That certainly didn't help matters. And then as public housing funding was being cut, the result was that these anti-segregation efforts largely failed. And also homelessness came back to a significant degree in the 1980s. And it's been that case. It really, we haven't moved that far from that position yet. We still have a long way to go.
Well, it's really interesting because when you look at Reagan and his constant demonization, the welfare queens, that was part of his rhetoric. And it's just been this constant culture of victim blaming. And we saw that in this show. And I want to echo everything you said. And I think I also want to say that the show is really good because it highlights what good architecture for public housing actually means. And what it means is controllable space, space that you have domain over, instead of having these public areas that are just riddled with drugs and loud people and crime in these common areas that can't possibly be policed, right? And the housing units, if they were ever going to work, these high rises, they needed governance, they needed security guards, they needed, and not cops that are just going to arrest everybody. I'm talking about people from within the community who are actually paid to patrol and clean. And we know what anarchy does to a country. And the same thing occurred in all the projects throughout America. All these high rises, same thing. People were just left to their own devices and then blamed when things didn't work out. No one was in charge. No one was enforcing rules. Nothing was being repaired. Budget cuts were all the rage, after Reagan. And, people give up when they feel hopeless. And lack of good management and cleanliness and dignity in housing projects is the surest way to create hopelessness in a population.
Right.
Sorry, go ahead.
So it's another positive feedback, right? The worse the conditions get, the more people give up. The worse the conditions get, the more people give up, and it spirals.
And the drugs are right there, and they represent their only escape, right? So, but even beyond the drugs and the crime and the general squalor, okay, it was actually the design of those projects that doomed them. And even the clustered housing that they built for these residents still smacks of segregation, right? They weren't single family homes, they were townhouses. And even though they were located in single family home neighborhoods, they were still like less than. And so it's a Band-Aid, right? What we really need in our society to solve these problems is full inclusion of minorities in our economy. And then a couple generations have to go by so that all of these people are part of the middle class and are able to afford normal housing. Not, so we don't just have diversity in the sense of pockets, but we have more of a homogenous multicultural dynamic in a city where everyone is able, your neighbor of color isn't making, 50% less than you are, kind of thing, right? Because they can't afford to live in that neighborhood if they are. So if you want integration, you have to have economic equality. And there shouldn't be any ethnic neighborhoods at all, right? When you think about it.
Sean, I just want to say that's a really good point about the anarchy. I think that without that kind of grassroots governance that we saw in the show, by the way, trying to establish that later on, not in the first 2 episodes, but later on, it makes a huge difference. Without that, things fall apart. And whether it happens at a micro level, a local level, or the national level, it's basically the same dynamic.
If you look at a white community, right? It's a gated community. They got a security guard. Nothing's going to go down in that neighborhood, right? Because somebody's watching. And it's crazy to me that you can have these high crime areas and there's no organization. There's no, it's not that the cops should patrol the area. That's not what I want, because I think that creates all these bad interactions, right? Where if the cops aren't a part of the community, then their presence is seen as hostile, right? So There needs to be patrolling from within the population. I don't know if that's government hiring security guards who live there. I don't know what the solution is. This is not my area of specialty in academically, but there are academic solutions and they're not being implemented as far as I know.
Yeah, I mean, the actual physical space has a lot to do with it as well. The kind of lighting, the kind of hallways, the kind of entrances, how the orientation of the homes in respect to each other. All of that either promotes community or it destroys community. And all of that's been researched. It is some wonderful literature about that, and it just has to be accessed.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. So the title of the series is Show Me a Hero, but who the villain is seems much more readily apparent than the hero, and that villain is Hank Spallone. He is the greasy, vile, sleazy embodiment of xenophobia itself, as far as I'm concerned. He leads the charge among those in the city council opposed to the housing by grandstanding, showboating, and making a lot of intellectually bankrupt, bad faith arguments. Contrarily, Nick seems to learn over these first 2 episodes rather quickly that the housing not only must be built, but it's actually the right thing to do. So my question is, since the events of this story, have we as a country become more like Nick, slowly learning from our mistakes and doing our best, or more like Spallone, angry, fearful, and xenophobic?
Well, look, I mean, white extinction anxiety is killing America. I think that is driving all of this. It's driving the COVID insanity. It's driving climate denial. It's driving our inability to establish systems that are safety nets, because white people are literally losing their minds. And this new census, the results that we just got, which shows that I believe white people are now only 57% of America, which is less than it was expected to be. It was expected to be something under 60, but 57 is a lot under 60, right? And so it's further going to inflame their already off the charts paranoia. They know how they've treated minorities, and they're very afraid of becoming a minority or even a plurality, right? And so we know this is all going to get worse before it gets better. And that character, would you say his name is Spallone? he is the epitome of that. And there's always going to be, we've seen it, there's always going to be politicians who are just going to jump all over that shit, right? I mean, they are just all over it. Like those two, the man and the woman who pointed guns at the Black Lives Matter protesters coming out of their home. That represents the entire sort of white scared demographic, with mustard on their shirt and just like, they're just, culturally bankrupt, living just in fear. And, it's probably going to succeed at some level, both local, state, and nationally, entrenching more of this minority rule for some period of time, because that they see that as the bulwark. They see that as like holding back the onslaught of minority demographics, right? And we'll only actually ever have democracy again when we have sufficient numbers of minorities to overwhelm all the Republican redistricting and cheating, right? The dam has to burst. It has to burst, or we turn into an apartheid nation. And we're headed in that direction, frankly. It's once democracy is off the table for real, there could be some real dark times, because if you're not going to house them, it's like Charles Murray. We talked about this on the Charles Murray episode, right? He said the only way to restore property values in the inner cities is basically to get rid of the residents. So where are they going to go? What is the plan of white people for, if you're not going to house them, you're not going to give them assistance, you're not going to feed them, no health care, where the only other plan for them is for them to die, right? Like, if you can't hack it in the capitalist system, death, right? That's what this is ultimately coming down to. So it is, I wish I had some better news about this.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
The other thing about Spallone, I think, there's another dimension to it, that he uses all these sentiments, including his own, as a means to personal power. And, politicians do that, celebrities like, Tucker Carlson do that. And that's the other dimension that I saw in him, that he's really conniving about it, and that he knew what he was doing. And whatever his sentiments were, like whatever was he like one of those parents, those people out in the crowd just like screaming with their faces red about, colored people, people of color being in his neighborhood or whatever? Or was he just like us? Or was he just being real conniving? Like, oh my God, this is a way I can grab power for myself. And I don't like those people, but that's not really it. So it was hard for me to tell which one, perhaps both. But I think what this show is kind of telling for me is that Americans have never really been a people. It's largely a national myth, a nation-building endeavor to create this mythology, and it's working less and less and less. I mean, and the racism is coming out more and more and more. A lot of the people in the crowd are saying, this isn't about race, it's about property values. Now, today you go to those crowds and they're like, yeah, man, it's about race. We hate those people. I mean, that's the kind of like, it's changed. It's gotten more visceral. And it's dog whistles are no longer needed.
Well, and one thing is the same as the other. I got to say, like if you say, because they kept saying, oh, it's about economics. Well, yeah, you cut benefits, you're going to hurt them. You're going to hurt those people, right? So
that's a form of oppression in and of itself.
It is. And so you can't just try to say, well, I don't care about they were saying, oh, well, if they can afford to live here, fine. Well, they can't. And they can't. So you might as well just use the N-word.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, like I said, we've always been divided, and the cleavages are along racial and cultural lines. Look at the Civil War. Look at, what happened after Reconstruction. Look at the apartheid system in the South. Look at, all the way through to my lifetime. Before, after I was born, we were still having this deep segregation. It's very recent, centuries of it. And, so I think both things are true, Nick. I think we have more of each kind. We have more Spallones, and then we have more, what's his name again, the politician?
Nick Wasicsko.
Yeah, Wasicsko. Yeah. We have both of them. We have more of both, actually, in some ways.
I think there's a lot of truth in that. So Catherine Keener's portrayal of Mary Dorman is one of the most compelling performances in a series loaded to the brim with compelling performances. In these first two episodes, it seems like we start to see the error of her ways. She goes from frothing at the mouth during the city council meetings to a point of being ejected by the officers to a rather reasonable phone call with Nick at the end of episode 2. One of the more notable moments is seeing her reaction when she starts hearing her fellow anti-housing protesters murmuring horrifically racist and Nazi-esque epithets while waiting outside the city council meeting. What are your thoughts on this character and how she develops in these first two episodes?
Well, it was masterful television. Nothing beats a redemption story. You really hate her in the beginning and you really come to love her at the end. And so, she was a great character, very well acted. That psychological journey that she makes, it's difficult and rare. She had to have something going on. She had to be, at least somewhat well educated or psychologically empathetic in order to make that journey. And the vast majority of hateful racists, they just keep doubling down until they're dead. And, as long as people are coming from a place of fear, they can't and won't see the humanity in people they hate.
Yeah, I think the character is probably one of the most interesting out of many interesting and compelling characters, like you said. By the end of the episode 2, she really begins to question what these protests are really all about. And she starts to be able to see sort of like the currents of power behind them that are sort of egging them on and sort of structuring them. And that's what America needs. America needs more of that vision, more of that awakening to these power dynamics that are happening. Americans are very bad about understanding power. And I think that for me, that's a wonderful story. She's personifying that.
Definitely.
Yeah, definitely, for sure. So the drug war, the Iraq war, the Katrina aftermath, public housing. It's pretty clear that Simon is particular about his projects and their subject matter and seems to gravitate towards topics of social significance. What do you guys think about these kinds of movies and series being harnessed as a tool for exploring and educating about these issues so directly? Are they effective in changing hearts and or minds? Because I personally found this series to be extremely powerful, and I think it is capable of provoking some thought.
Yeah, I agree. I think this series really affected me. Now, I know all this stuff intellectually, right? And I've experienced even personally some of it. But I was left emotionally drained by this series in a good way. Like it was a piece of art. It really was. And what art's supposed to do is shake people up. It's supposed to really, wake you up and make you think in different ways. And that's what, this series did. And it wasn't on the nose. It was brilliantly done. I didn't hold your hand and walk you through it. It just simply showed you all this in a very compelling way. And that's what made it powerful for me.
Yeah, and for me, what I liked about the way that it portrayed the characters of color was that they were portrayed as absolutely normal. They had dignity. They had hopes and dreams. They weren't. Even though they had some problems, like, some of them had drug problems, some of them had domestic problems, and but it was very straightforward, and you could immediately empathize with them, and that's why the series kind of made me sad, because this is also set in the past, and I think that time in the late 80s, a lot of civil rights momentum has been lost since then. And these kinds of lawsuits and desegregation efforts were really going strong at that time. It was only, 10, 15 years or 20 years after the passage of the Civil Rights Act. And we still had, Bill Clinton was elected after that. We had multiple Democratic administrations that have done things. And, it just seems like some of that, the backlash, like you said, Joe, Republican backlash, it's been severe. Trump appointed something like 200 judges. So how many more of these sorts of legal orders are we going to get that are going to survive a Supreme Court challenge to do something like build integrated housing in cities, right? That's like it's a tall order these days. And it makes it sort of seem like the kind of justice that we saw, in the series be a thing of the past. And, again, California punted its housing reform bill in 2020. And, one more time after doing this for multiple years. So if Democrats can't deliver on this in a blue state, and we don't have the judges in the red states to make it happen, where's the hope that anyone can do this, that we can ever achieve housing justice and desegregation?
Yeah, those are all good questions.
Yeah, they are.
Those are all good questions. So you guys have any closing thoughts or observations here?
Well, I think oppression is about disempowerment. I mean, we talk about empowerment all the time. It's almost become a catchphrase. Nobody even thinks about what it really means anymore. But it really is oppression and subjugation. It's about disempowerment. It's making people powerless. And so when people do become powerless, then it takes something to get them back and feeling that they do have agency in their lives. And so even when we were talking about how it was hard to form sort of organizing community committees to sort of manage these properties, that takes a certain psychology of empowerment, which has to be nurtured, has to be worked on because it's been so oppressed over generations of time, not just but with individuals, but with generations, right? It goes back and back and back, and that's what we need to think about as well. That this grassroots, very sort of personal and psychological journey that we can make together as communities, and we can help disempower people become more empowered. How do we do that? That's really another good question, right? The government has a huge role to play in all this by providing the resources, right? They have the resources. We don't. They do. But we can provide as advocates and as activists. We can provide that space and that help with that journey as best we can. I think that's one way to think about, and that's what happened in the 1950s with the civil rights movement. That's what it really was all about. It was, down to earth grassroots, and unfortunately, the right learned from that and did it themselves later on. But I mean, I think that's one thing that's kind of hopeful out of all this, is that we do have that avenue still, even though the courts are being filled with right-wing judges and all of the stuff you talked about. I don't know, maybe I'm being a little Pollyannic about it. I'm not sure, but I think there's something to it. I think that there is I'm hoping, and I think it's true, that there's a lot more Nicks, Wasiskos, and there are, and also not just Nick Wasicskos, but a lot more Mary Dormans than there are Spallones out there. And I think the Spallones are very vocal. They've organized, they're very powerful. It's not a small group, it's a big group for sure, it's a large group, but I don't think they're the majority. I don't. And I think that we need to start to mobilize everyone else.
I agree. And it seems to me also, like what you said, Drew, about this being a really good teaching tool. It is, but it's on HBO, not ABC, right? And I looked at the viewing statistics, and it was like 300,000 or 400,000 people, right? We need millions of people to be seeing these shows to see what the stakes are. And ironically, people who already probably agree with what needs to be done for desegregation are the ones watching HBO. It's like, not a lot of conservatives, I don't think, subscribe to HBO. And if they do, they're not watching liberal political shows about integration like this. So, but I am encouraged by what you said, Joe, and I do feel this also, that at a grassroots level, it feels to me like Black Lives Matter was the start of something. That organization is maturing. There's a lot of grassroots activism. We saw tremendous. We see tremendous pride in our athletes of color that were at the Olympics. We see strength. And I am hopeful, and I'm also hopeful about youth. Okay, because I don't think we talked about that. Nick Wasicsko's age during the episode. The guy was younger than my oldest son when he became mayor of Yonkers and accomplished all this, and that is stunning to me. Okay, he was in his 20s, and it just goes to show that young people have far more power than they realize. And let's hope that they use it to make some real change, because my generation, your generation, Joe, has let them down in so many ways.
Absolutely. Although I do want to remind, do you remember, Sean, watching Roots when you were little?
I actually have never seen it.
I was riveted. I was really young. I was a kid, and I was riveted, and so was everybody else in my little circle. That show had an amazing impact on America, and because it was watched by, I think, 2/3 of America. I mean, it was
It was on ABC or something, right?
Yeah. It was watched by just tens of millions of people, and I think it helped change the consciousness in many ways. And I think these shows do the same, but everything's all fragmented now in media, right? So no, we don't get those big numbers anymore. But if we have enough of these shows, then that's another avenue, right?
Well, it was extremely well made. It was made with love. I mean, you could just tell the care that went into every shot in that series. It's like, and when I first was watching it, it was a little slow, and they started with that flashback of the end, and I was like, what the hell's going on here? And it took me a while to really warm up to what was happening in the series. But by the time I was 10, 20 minutes into the first episode, I knew what we were in for.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The cold open is a little strange, but it definitely makes sense by the end of the series.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and we'll get there. But I think that's our show for today, and we'll be doing follow-up installments to cover the remaining 4 episodes of Show Me a Hero. So be sure to subscribe and follow us on YouTube and social media to stay updated on all our future content. And remember, if you like our show, hit the like button on YouTube. Leave a comment, leave a review, support us on Patreon if you're in position to support the show, and tell your friends to listen. Any and all of these help the show tremendously, and we appreciate all of your support. New episodes post Mondays at noon Eastern on YouTube and all the major podcast channels. We also publish new articles weekly in our journal at theradicalsecular.com. I'm Drew Scott. Thank you for being here, and remember, wherever you are, you can be radically secular.
The Radical Secular podcast is written and produced by Christoph Defoe, Sean Prophet, Joe Occhipinti, and Drew Scott. Artwork and design by Tim Stetner. Post-production and theme music by Sean Prophet. Special thanks to our support team, Lindsay Brightman, Jillian Sky Jacobs, and Lori Field Occhipinti.